If you show portraits of Latin American revolutionaries like Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and Fidel Castro, most people would immediately recognize only Che. But why did he, rather than his comrades, become the global symbol of revolution? Today, Che Guevara is not just a historical figure, but a true cultural phenomenon. As the philosopher Regis Debray aptly noted, Che was killed twice, first by a bullet, then by millions of his portraits. His iconic image is now found everywhere, from t-shirts to posters, and even graffiti. He has become a symbol of the struggle for justice, freedom, and change. But who is behind this famous face? Opinions on Che Guevara vary greatly, from Saint Ernesto, revered by Bolivian peasants, to the Butcher of La Cabana, as some Cuban immigrants in the US call him. However, the Comandante's determination to achieve revolutionary ideals is undisputed. Che Guevara will forever be remembered in history as a revolutionary willing to risk everything for his convictions. To understand his life is to see how his ideals influence the destinies of people, prompting us to consider the meaning of revolution in our time. To better understand what drove Che Guevara when he embarked on the path of revolution, we must first grasp what Cuba was like at the end of the 1920s. In 1898, following the end of the Spanish-American War, Cuba gained its long-awaited independence from Spain. However, rather than achieving true freedom, the country fell into economic dependence on the United States. Nearly simultaneously, Cuba earned a reputation as an exotic place where practically anything was possible, drawing in American mobsters and members of the bohemian lifestyle. Heirs to large fortunes relaxed there, and even New York City Mayor Jimmy Bo James Walker was known to visit. They were attracted to gambling, golf, country clubs, horse racing, and Cuban women. Havana back then was what Las Vegas would become, says Cuban historian Luis Perez. But while tourists eagerly spun the roulette wheel and entertained themselves in Havana, local residents struggled to make ends meet. Political and economic instability swept over Cuba, with U.S. influence permeating all spheres of life. President Gerardo Machado, who came to power in 1925 with promises of prosperity, quickly turned into a brutal dictator. Under his control, the country was handed over to corrupt elites who served the interests of foreign corporations, especially in the sugar industry. Cuba's economy had long depended on sugar exports, but by 1929, the global economic crisis drastically changed it. Sugar prices plummeted, leading to the closure of many plantations and processing factories. The peasants living around these plantations found themselves on the brink of survival. While American tourists flocked to Havana's casinos and hotels, the local population suffered from hunger and poverty. Workers on the plantations, known as mecheros, worked only 3 months a year for meager wages, and for the remaining 9 months, they roamed the country unemployed, angry, and hungry. The streets of Cuba were filled with disappointment and anger. The people could no longer endure poverty and injustice. Student protests and workers' strikes began to rise. Revolutionary sentiments started to sweep across the country. In this boiling atmosphere, Cuba turned into a powder keg ready to explode. Cubans, weary from years of repression, poverty, and injustice, were no longer afraid of change. And in the coming decades, individuals would emerge on the scene who would turn the course of Cuban history, leading it to one of the most significant revolutions of the 20th century. One of these individuals was Ernesto Rafael Guevara, the future revolutionary, born on June 14, 1928, in the Argentine city of Rosario to Ernesto Guevara Lynch, an architect, and Celia de la Serna, a hereditary aristocrat. Their life could not be described as carefree. Despite owning holly plantations, from which the famous mate tea was made, their finances constantly suffered from droughts and market fluctuations. Ernesto was the eldest of 5 children and learned to overcome difficulties from an early age. The first challenge for the future revolutionary was asthma, which left little Ernesto, or Tete, as his parents affectionately called him, literally gasping for breath. He suffered from this illness his entire life, and this trial strengthened him. The family moved to the town of Alta Gracia, hoping to improve their son's health, and although the fresh air helped him feel better, the asthma persisted. He once said, "Asthma doesn't stop me from moving forward, I stop it." This principle of unyielding will would become emblematic of his character. Young Teta's education began at home under the guidance of his mother, who introduced him to the world of books. He was passionate about literature with incredible fervor. Jack London, Jules Verne, Pablo Neruda, Freud, and later Camus, Sartre, as well as Karl Marx, who would play a huge role in shaping the future revolutionaries' views. In 1947, the family moved to Buenos Aires, and Ernesto enrolled in the medical school. It was here that his worldview began to change. A pivotal moment in Ernesto's life occurred in 1951, when he embarked on his legendary journey across Latin America. Together with his friend Alberto Granado, a young biochemist, he undertook a daring plan to travel across the continent on a motorcycle named La Poderosa II, which translates to the Mighty One. This trip was not just an adventure. It introduced Ernesto to the real Latin America, its poverty, inequality, and suffering. The journey took over 6 months, during which the friends traveled nearly 10,000 kilometers through Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. Ernesto and Alberto worked as dock workers and dishwashers, slept in abandoned buildings, often went hungry, and constantly encountered the hardships of life in poor communities. They even lived and worked in leper colonies, providing medical care despite the risks. In one of his letters, Ernesto wrote, "Being among them is like being cut off from society. They are invisible." He would later say that this journey made him truly think about injustice. Unfortunately, the motorcycle, the Mighty One, could not withstand the challenges of the road and broke down halfway through the journey. However, Ernesto and Alberto continued their travels by hitchhiking, taking ferries, and walking. These months permanently changed the young student. Upon returning, he could no longer be the same. "I saw the filth, injustice, and sorrow that I couldn't turn away from," he wrote in his diaries, which later became the book, The Motorcycle Diaries, and were adapted into a film of the same name. This journey became a turning point in his life. Ernesto realized that his calling was not to heal bodies, but to fight for the soul and rights of the people. He became increasingly interested in Marxism and ideas of social justice, which eventually led him to the path of a revolutionary. "I couldn't just return to my life and forget about all of this. I felt that I had to do something." The next important step was his trip to Guatemala in 1953, where President Arbenz was implementing reforms by nationalizing land from large corporations, including the American United Fruit Company. These actions provoked a strong reaction from the United States, which labeled Guatemala a red threat. The Americans organized a military invasion in 1954, and Ernesto joined the local militia to defend the government against mercenaries. This experience further solidified his convictions. He would later say, "The conquest of freedom is worth any sacrifice." When Arbenz's government fell, Ernesto, by then a convinced Marxist, was forced to move to Mexico. There, he met the Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro. It is said that their first conversation lasted all night, and at the end, Castro invited him to join the future expedition to Cuba against Batista's regime. Without much hesitation, Ernesto agreed. By that time, Che, in addition to his medical experience, already had combat experience and strong convictions. It was in Mexico that he was given the nickname Che, due to the Argentine habit of saying Che in conversation. The preparation for the Cuban Revolution became a test of endurance and determination. As a doctor, Che would become not just a participant in the uprising, but an important figure in it. Early in the morning on November 25, 1956, 82 people under the command of Fidel Castro set out on the yacht Grandma towards Cuba. Originally, this 12-meter boat was meant to hold only 12 passengers, but the rebels managed to squeeze in, quite literally, on top of each other. The conditions were harsh, and the rough sea made the journey difficult. But after 7 days, on December 2nd, the yacht finally reached the shores of Cuba. However, the vessel ran aground near the coast, and the group was forced to make their way through the water. Almost immediately, they were fired upon by Batista's government forces. It was impossible to avoid the initial encounter with the 35,000-strong army equipped with tanks and aircraft. The rebels suffered heavy losses, but despite this, the survivors, including Che Guevara, took refuge in the Sierra Maestra Mountains and began a guerrilla war. There, they received support from the peasants, who helped with food supplies and even joined their ranks. Soon, the group became a real army, which started capturing outposts, barracks, and even factories, creating its own infrastructure, hospitals, workshops for producing grenades, and even a small tobacco factory. An interesting fact, the insurgents launched a newspaper, El Cubano Libre, to counter Batista's propaganda, initially written by hand and later printed on a homemade press. By 1958, the influence of the rebels had become impossible to ignore. The army was growing every month, and revolutionary groups began uprising across the country. Comandante Che and his columns marched towards the major cities. And on December 27th, the assault on Santa Clara, the last stronghold on the way to Havana, began. After capturing the city, the rebels derailed an armored train with machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons and were able to drive the enemy out of all key buildings. On January 1st, 1959, Santa Clara was entirely under the control of the revolutionaries, and Batista fled the country. After the revolution's victory, Che Guevara immediately received Cuban citizenship and became involved in post-revolutionary life. Comandante took on numerous responsibilities to solidify the success and implement major reforms. Initially, Guevara was appointed head of the Department of Industry at the National Institute of Agrarian Reform and later became the head of the National Bank of Cuba. In response to the question of how he, a person far removed from finance, became a banker, Che jokingly replied, "I was simply the only one who raised his hand at the meeting." Interestingly, on the banknotes from that era, you can still see the signature Che instead of a surname. This is how he left his mark on Cuba's financial system. However, his reforms and innovations were also of a harsh nature. Guevara led policies of repression against counter-revolutionaries, and he was ruthless with those he considered enemies of the revolution. In the fortress of La Cabana, which became a prison for many opponents of the new regime, Ernesto oversaw tribunals that sentenced to death those deemed dangerous to the revolution. It is believed that he personally signed the death warrants for dozens of people and advocated for revolutionary justice, emphasizing that the revolution could not afford delays. In his writings, he mentioned, "This is not about justice in the bourgeois sense. This is about the struggle for the survival of the revolution." Che also played a role in the creation of labor camps known as UMAP camps, military units to aid production, where those who, for various reasons, did not conform to the values of the new order were sent. This included political opponents, former officials, and even homosexuals, whom the Batista regime equated with unreliable elements. Conditions in these camps were brutal, forcing inmates to engage in manual labor under extremely harsh conditions. Aside from repressive measures, Che was actively involved in Cuba's international affairs. He was attracted to the expansion of revolutionary ideals beyond the country's borders, and as Minister of Industry, he repeatedly visited socialist countries, negotiated trade agreements with the USSR, expanded the export of Cuban sugar, and established military cooperation. In 1964, he delivered a fiery speech at the United Nations General Assembly, where he harshly criticized the United States for its intervention in Latin American affairs and called for a global struggle against imperialism. "We are ready to die for our ideas if necessary. We are ready to die for the freedom of Cuba and all the oppressed people of the world." However, by the mid-1960s, Che became disillusioned with the bureaucratic and overly dependent nature of the new Cuba on the USSR. He felt that the revolution had stalled and was not achieving its goals. He dreamed of a global movement for the liberation of peoples. Ultimately, leaving behind his positions, titles, and even his family, Che decided to go to other countries to fight for independence. Initially, he went to the Congo to support local forces against colonial troops, but his mission there ended in failure. Later, he went to Bolivia, where he attempted to spark a new uprising. In Bolivia, Che Guevara encountered strong resistance, and in 1967, after prolonged fighting and betrayal, he was captured and executed in October. There are also a number of conspiracy theories regarding the Comandante's death, one of the most famous being that Che's death was orchestrated by the CIA. His captors did not care about the dignity and etiquette that his revolutionary legacy demanded, and he was shamefully murdered. But history remembers only the cowardice of these murderers, while Che's colossal example lives on and multiplies day by day, noted Cuba's vice president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. The secret services prepared and were involved with the battalion that was to capture and kill Guevara, as shown by declassified CIA documents stored in the George Washington University archive. According to one of the reports, the order to kill Guevara and other Marxist fighters who were trying to bring the Cuban Revolution to Bolivia was given on the morning of October 9th, marking a departure from previous orders. The first soldier tasked with executing Guevara could not carry out the order, so it was passed to another soldier who bolstered his courage with several beers. The summary also confirmed that Guevara, refusing to sit at the executioner's order, uttered his last words, "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man," before the soldier fired at him with his M2 carbine, throwing Guevara back against the wall of the small house. Guevara's bones and those of 6 of his followers exhumed on July 5th in Valle Grande after a 19-month search for their grave were repatriated to Cuba on July 12th, just minutes after a team of anthropologists publicly confirmed their identities. CIA operative Felix Rodriguez was in the battalion that captured Guevara and interrogated the revolutionary fighter before his death. As he recounted in interviews many years later, the order to execute the prisoner came from the high command of the Bolivian armed forces, while his order as a CIA officer was to keep him alive. In a White House memorandum signed by Walt Whitman Rostow, National Security Advisor to President Lyndon B. Johnson, the order for Guevara's killing was also attributed to Bolivian military leader General Alfredo Ovando Candia. "I regard this as stupid," Rostow wrote about the execution order, adding, "but it is understandable from a Bolivian standpoint." However, 2 American human rights and civil rights lawyers did not believe that the CIA's role could be so easily dismissed. In their book, Who Killed Che? How the CIA Got Away with Murder, Michael Ratner and Michael Stephen Smith reviewed previously unpublished documents from the CIA, the White House, the State Department, and the Department of Defense, and argued that the CIA wanted and expected Guevara to be killed if captured. The government's line was, "The Bolivians did it and there was nothing we could do about it." That's not true. The whole operation was organized out of the White House by Walt Whitman Rostow and the CIA. Smith said in an interview with Democracy Now! In 2012, "The US wanted Che's death because it was a way to put an end to revolutionary fervor in Latin America and around the world," added Ratner. Summarizing this theory, it's important to say that although there is no direct evidence of CIA involvement in the order for Che's execution, the presence of American agents and US interests in the region have generated numerous rumors and theories about possible intervention. Partially declassified documents do not provide a definitive answer to this question, leaving space for further research and speculation surrounding these events.